Picture this. You're standing in a grand palace somewhere in ancient Egypt, and the smell of burning incense fills your lungs. The walls are covered in gold. Hieroglyphs tell stories of gods walking among men, and right there in front of you, a young queen is about to give birth. But here's the thing that'll make your stomach turn. The father of that child isn't just her husband. He's her brother, and everybody knows it. They celebrate it. They demand it. Welcome to the darkest secret of ancient royalty, where keeping the bloodline pure meant destroying it from the inside out. Now, before you click away thinking this is just some twisted tale, let me tell you something that'll blow your mind. This wasn't some rare, hidden scandal. This was policy. This was tradition. This was law. For thousands of years, the most powerful families on earth believed that mixing their blood with commoners would weaken their divine right to rule. So they did something that goes against every natural instinct we have. They married their siblings, their children, sometimes even their parents. And the consequences? Man, the consequences were absolutely catastrophic. Let me take you back to Egypt first, because that's where this whole nightmare really kicks into gear. The Ptolemaic dynasty wasn't just any royal family. These folks ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, and they had one rule that trumped everything else. Never ever let outside blood contaminate the royal line. Cleopatra, yeah, the Cleopatra, the one you've seen in movies, the legendary beauty who seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She was married to her own brother, Ptolemy the 13th. The dude was like 10 years old when they got hitched. She was 18. And yeah, that marriage was expected to produce heirs. Now here's where it gets really messed up. This wasn't Cleopatra being some kind of villain. She was following a tradition that went back centuries in her family. Her parents were siblings. Her grandparents were siblings. Go back far enough in her family tree and you'll find it doesn't branch out. It just goes straight up like a telephone pole. Geneticists today look at the Ptolemaic family, and their heads just explode trying to figure out how these people survived as long as they did. But Egypt was just getting started with this madness. Go back even further, way before Cleopatra, to the time of the pharaohs. We're talking ancient Egypt, when these god kings ruled the Nile and everybody believed they were literally divine beings walking on earth. Pharaohs married their sisters like it was the most natural thing in the world. Why? Because they believed their blood was sacred, that it carried the essence of the gods themselves. To marry a commoner would be like, well, it'd be like a god marrying a mortal. Unthinkable, impossible, blasphemous. Take Tutankhamun. Yeah, King Tut, the boy king with the famous golden mask. Everybody knows his name, but what they don't teach you in school is that his parents were probably father and daughter. DNA testing done on his mummy revealed a genetic nightmare. The kid had a club foot, a cleft palate, and a bone disease that probably made every day of his short life absolute agony. He died at 19. Some scientists think he couldn't even walk without a cane. All that suffering, all that pain, because somebody centuries before decided that keeping the bloodline pure was more important than keeping it healthy. And here's the kicker. They knew. They absolutely knew something was wrong. You can't have generation after generation of sick kids, stillbirths, and early deaths without noticing a pattern. But they kept doing it anyway because tradition, religion, and power mattered more than the screaming evidence right in front of their faces. Now let's hop across the world to Hawaii, because this madness wasn't limited to Egypt. The Hawaiian, the royal class, they had their own twisted version of bloodline purity. Brother-sister marriages weren't just allowed, they were considered sacred. The highest rank you could achieve, the Neopil rank, could only come from a brother and sister having a child together. These weren't distant cousins we're talking about, full siblings. Same mother, same father. And the child born from that union was considered so sacred that commoners had to literally crawl on their bellies in their presence. The Hawaiians believed that mana, spiritual power, was strongest when it was concentrated. Mixing with outside families diluted that power. So the royal families did everything they could to keep it concentrated, even if it meant watching their children suffer with genetic defects, even if it meant babies dying before they could take their first breath. The pursuit of divine power trumped everything else, including basic human compassion. Swing down to South America now, to the Incan Empire, where things got even more systematically messed up. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was required by law to marry his full sister. Not encouraged, not suggested, required. This was non-negotiable. The thinking was that since the Sapa Inca was the son of the sun god Inti, his sister was the only woman on earth worthy of being his wife. Anybody else would contaminate the divine bloodline. The Spanish conquistadors who rolled into Peru in the 1500s were absolutely horrified by this practice. And these were dudes who weren't exactly squeamish about violence and cruelty. But even they looked at Incan royal marriage practices and went, "Yo, that's messed up." Of course, the irony is that Spanish royalty had their own issues with cousin marriages, but at least they drew the line at siblings. The Incans. No such line existed. Head over to Persia next, to the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest empires the ancient world ever saw. The Persians practiced something called exvit vidatha, which is a fancy word for marrying your close relatives. We're talking siblings, we're talking parent-child marriages, the whole 9 yards. And this wasn't some fringe practice either. This was baked into Zoroastrianism, the dominant religion of the Persian Empire. Priests actively encouraged it. They taught that these marriages were spiritually beneficial, that they increased your chances of getting into paradise. Greek historians who visited Persia couldn't believe what they were seeing. They wrote about it extensively, their accounts dripping with shock and disgust. But here's the thing. The Persians thought the Greeks were the weird ones for not doing it. Cultural relativism is a trip, man. What's horrifying to one civilization is sacred to another. Now, Zoroastrian scholars today will tell you that those Greek accounts were exaggerated, that maybe the practice wasn't as widespread as the Greeks claimed. But archaeological evidence and Zoroastrian texts themselves reference these marriages, so something was definitely going on. And even if it wasn't universal, the fact that it happened at all in one of history's greatest empires tells you how powerful the idea of bloodline purity really was. Jump over to Korea during the Joseon dynasty. Now, Korean royalty wasn't as extreme as some of these other examples, but they still had their issues. The Yongbin class, the aristocratic elite, practiced clan endogamy, which is a fancy way of saying they only married within very specific family groups. While direct sibling marriages weren't common, cousin marriages absolutely were, and the genetic consequences started piling up over the centuries. Hemophilia, mental illness, physical deformities, all of it ran rampant through Korean royal lines. The fascinating thing about Korea is that Confucian philosophy actually discouraged close relative marriages, but political and economic pressures made them continue anyway. Families wanted to consolidate power and wealth. They wanted to keep land and titles within their control, so they found ways to justify what their own philosophy told them was wrong. Humans are really good at that, twisting ideology to fit what we want to do anyway. Africa had its own version of this nightmare too. Various tribal kingdoms and royal families practiced incestuous succession systems. In some regions, a king's heir had to be born from a union between the king and his daughter to be considered legitimate. In others, brother-sister marriages among royalty were standard practice. The reasoning was always the same: purity of bloodline, concentration of power, divine right to rule. The consequences were always the same too: sick children, early deaths, genetic disasters that got worse with every generation. And then there's Rome. Oh man, Rome. The Roman Empire officially frowned on incest. Roman law explicitly prohibited it. But that didn't stop the emperors from doing whatever the hell they wanted. Caligula, one of the most infamous emperors in history, was rumored to have had relationships with all 3 of his sisters. The most notorious was Drusilla. Ancient sources claim he not only had an ongoing relationship with her, but that she became pregnant with his child. Now, were these rumors true? Historians still argue about it. Roman writers loved sensational gossip, and Caligula had plenty of enemies who would have spread any rumor they could to damage his reputation. But here's what we know for sure. Caligula openly showed favoritism to Drusilla, gave her honors usually reserved for empresses, and when she died, he declared her a goddess. That's not normal brother-sister behavior, even by Roman standards. Where there's that much smoke, there's usually at least a little fire. What's really disturbing is that even if the pregnancy rumors weren't true, the fact that people believed they could be true tells you something about Caligula's reputation. This was a guy who allegedly appointed his horse as a senator, who killed people on a whim, who claimed to be a living god. Incest. That wouldn't even crack his top 10 most disturbing acts. But here's the question that really matters. Why? Why did so many different cultures, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years, all come to the same twisted conclusion that marrying your siblings was a good idea? The answer is actually pretty simple, and it reveals something dark about human nature. Power, that's it. That's the whole answer. These families had power, absolute, total, godlike power, and they were terrified of losing it. Every time a royal married outside the family, that was a potential threat. That outsider brought their own family connections, their own allies, their own agenda. They diluted the purity of the bloodline, and more importantly, they created competing claims to power. But if you married your sister, your brother, there was no outside family to worry about, no competing interests, no dilution of power. Everything stayed locked down tight within the family circle. Sure, your kids might be sick, but they'd be yours completely. Your blood, your control, your dynasty. These royal families basically chose short-term power over long-term survival, and you can see the results written in history. Almost every dynasty that practiced extensive inbreeding eventually collapsed. The Habsburg dynasty in Europe became so inbred that the last Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, couldn't even chew his own food. His tongue was too big for his mouth, his jaw was severely deformed, and he was probably intellectually disabled. The dynasty ended with him because he was completely infertile. Centuries of cousin marriages had led to that pathetic conclusion. The Egyptian dynasties eventually fell to outside invaders who had, functional genetics. The Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown. The Incan Empire was conquered. The Persian Empire eventually transformed, and those old marriage practices faded away. Over and over again, we see the same pattern. Inbreeding led to weakness, and weakness led to conquest. But here's what really gets me. These weren't stupid people. Ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. The Incans created an empire without wheels or written language. The Persians administered a massive empire with incredible efficiency. Hawaiians navigated thousands of miles of open ocean using just the stars. These were brilliant civilizations with incredible achievements, but they couldn't figure out that making babies with your siblings was a bad idea. Come on, they had to know. Farmers knew not to breed animals too closely or the offspring would be weak. The information was right there, but they ignored it because ideology, whether religious or political, trumped observable reality. That's the real lesson here. When we let ideology override evidence, when we let tradition override common sense, when we let power override basic human decency, terrible things happen. And before anybody gets comfortable thinking this is all ancient history, remember that cousin marriages were common in European royalty up until like 100 years ago. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were first cousins. Their descendants spread hemophilia throughout the royal houses of Europe like wildfire. Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, suffered terribly from hemophilia inherited through this line. The disease and the charlatan Rasputin who claimed to treat it played a role in the destabilization that led to the Russian Revolution. So yeah, this obsession with bloodline purity literally helped topple empires and reshape the 20th century. The wildest part of this whole story isn't just that these practices happened. It's that they happened everywhere, independently. Different continents, different eras, different religions, all coming to the same destructive conclusion about how to maintain power. It's like humanity had to learn this lesson over and over again, in the hardest way possible, before we finally figured out that genetic diversity is actually strength, not weakness. Today, we look back at these royal families with a mixture of fascination and horror. We put their treasures in museums. We make documentaries about their lives. We turn their stories into entertainment. But we should also remember them as a warning. They show us what happens when people value abstract ideas like purity and tradition more than the actual welfare of human beings. They show us the danger of creating systems where a tiny elite holds all the power and makes all the rules, even when those rules are obviously destructive. These royal pregnancies weren't just scandalous or shocking. They were symptoms of a much larger disease, the disease of absolute power combined with absolute certainty. These families believed so completely in their own divine right to rule, in their own superiority, that they were willing to sacrifice their own children's health and happiness to maintain that belief. And the really disturbing thing, lots of people went along with it. Priests blessed these unions. Nobles celebrated them. Commoners accepted them as the natural order of things. So yeah, when you're scrolling through history and you come across these stories of royal incest, don't just think, wow, that's messed up, and move on. Stop and think about what it really means. Think about the children born into those families, who never had a choice, who suffered with genetic diseases because of decisions made generations before they were born. Think about the mothers who had to watch their babies die, knowing somewhere deep down that the family's traditions were to blame. Think about the doctors and advisors who must have known the truth but stayed silent because you don't argue with kings and emperors. These weren't just weird footnotes in history. These were real people living real tragedies, all in the name of maintaining power and purity. And the saddest part, if you could go back and tell them what we know now about genetics, about inherited diseases, about the importance of genetic diversity, most of them probably still wouldn't have changed a thing, because it was never really about having healthy children or strong families. It was always about power, control, and the desperate fear of losing both. That's the bloodline curse, not just the genetic defects and the sick children, but the way power corrupts our most basic instincts and turns families into dynasties, love into political strategy, and children into pawns in a game they never asked to play. The ancient royals thought they were preserving something precious. Instead, they were destroying it, one generation at a time, until there was nothing left but ruins and cautionary tales. And maybe that's exactly what they deserve to be remembered as, not as divine rulers or sacred bloodlines, but as a warning about what happens when we lose our humanity in the pursuit of power. Because at the end of the day, beneath all the crowns and palaces and golden masks, they were just people. Broken, flawed, tragic people who made terrible choices and paid terrible prices. Their bloodlines are dust now, but their lessons remain. We just have to be smart enough to learn them.